Greetings, people who will likely wish they had clicked on something else. I'd like to do just a quick review of some of my verb tense ideas. I did a few verb tense videos, and I'd like to review this before I move on to making my esoterica videos. So if you'll bear with me. Now here's the contemporary tense groups, the traditional names: simple, perfect, progressive, perfect progressive. And here's the new names that I invented, I made up in my system called amplified verb tense. But we're going to use these contemporary names today. We're going to use the traditional names when we talk about tense. Now, I discussed in my other videos that how tense realization happens. There's three main factors to consider. One is the verb form, auxiliaries, if any, and then the context. Context is the parts of a discourse that surround a word or passage and help to explain its meaning. I talked about that. So your verb has ordinarily 5 forms. Everything except the verb be will have 5 forms, possible forms. And here they are. I did a video on that. And verbs sometimes come with helping or auxiliary words, sometimes called helping verbs or auxiliary verbs. And I talked about that, so I don't need to talk too much. And context, again, is the setting in which something occurs. So these are the 3 main factors that you must keep in mind when you're working on verb tense and trying to come up with just the right verb. So the definition of tense has changed over the years. Back in the day, let's say 35 years ago, someone would say, tense shows the time of a verb's action. All right, then maybe 25 years ago, a good grammar book would tell you that tense indicates the time of an action in relation to the time of the speaking or writing about the action. That's what they would have told you in their definition. So my more current contemporary definition would be a little more complicated. I would say in a given discourse, whether it consists of one sentence or multiple sentences, tense is the reasonably accurate perception of when the actions of the sentence's verbs occurred in relation to the very moment the speaker speaks or writes the given sentences. So that's a pretty thorough definition. And that's the one we'll keep in mind as we move on. Now here's example number 1 of a kind of a little cute little thing I invented to help young children or new students learn tense and figure out what's going on. In other words, what's the verb really doing? So here in example number 1, the sentence would be, presently, I am driving at the speed of 60 miles per hour. So all we do is to help the student learn is we draw a line, a baseline, and we can call it a timeline. And the past would be on this side, your left, and the future would be on the right. And here the letter M stands for the moment of speech. That's when you're speaking these words, okay? The moment of speech. So the little thing I invented was called the time phrase. And the time phrase is a useful little tool to help you know when the action of the verb is happening specifically. So here you have the moment of speech, and you're saying, presently, I am driving at the speed of 60 miles per hour. So you see, at the moment of speech when you're talking, you're actually driving. The tense here would be in the traditional contemporary sense, present progressive, and you see that when you're speaking, you're actually driving. So their time phrase, a helpful little hint, would be during the moment of speech. That's what you say. Here's your timeline. This is your visual. And your time phrase, right, in your mind would be during the moment of speech. Okay, example number 2. I had driven almost 10 miles before I realized that I had forgotten my tools. Okay, so we see I had driven, the red line. Had driven is your past perfect tense. And here's the red line. In other words, before you spoke, you had already driven. That's the red line, all right? And then you say, before I realized. Okay, realize the line is blue, and right there is your blue line. In other words, you realized after you had driven, but before the moment of speaking these words, okay? Then you say, I had forgotten my tools. So the forgetting, that's the green line, is right here. The forgetting happened before the driving and before the realization. So your time phrase, your little helpful hint, your helpful phrase would be before the moment of speech, okay? I had driven almost 10 miles before I realized that I had forgotten my tools. So had driven, realized, and had forgotten. So you visually can see it. It's kind of nice, it's easy to visualize. And your time phrase would be before the moment of speech. And here's your verb tenses for that sentence. All right. Example number 3. If I drive until 4 p.m., I will have driven 120 miles. So here's your timeline, it's just a line. Here's your moment of speech. And you see the word if here. So that tells us that we're in the subjunctive mood. And the subjunctive kind of hints at something like a hypothetical situation or a wish or a suggestion or something other than an actual fact yet. In other words, the actual fact hasn't happened yet. Okay, that's called the subjunctive mood. So you see here, if I drive, that's the red line. Okay, if I drive, all right, that means you drive after the moment of speech, all right? Until 4 p.m., I will have driven 120 miles. And there's the blue, all right, will have driven. So if I drive until 4 p.m., I will have driven 120 miles. And that's the blue line. So you see clearly that the time phrase, the helpful phrase that you can think in your mind is after the moment of speech. In other words, the action of either verb will be after the moment of speech. And here's your verb tenses for those verbs. All right. Example number 4. Subjunctive mood again. If I drive 2 more hours, I will have driven a total of 240 miles. So here's your timeline. If I drive, that's the red line. If I drive here, in other words, right after the moment of speech, I will have driven a total of 240 miles. So you see, will have driven means the total miles driven would be 240. So you see, in each hour, then he drove 120 miles. I mean, if he finished. Okay, so you see the timeline, you get a nice little visual, and the time phrase would be before and after the moment of speech. You see, you have some before stuff here, all right? And then you have some after stuff. And your verb tenses are here. That's in the contemporary or traditional sense. That's what you'd call it. Example number 5. I am driving to Boston. If I drive 2 more hours, I will have driven a total of 240 miles. Well, you see here, we have 2 sentences in our discourse, not just one. So now we have to take into consideration context. It's very important. Context is really important when you're reading a few sentences or a paragraph, okay? So you have your basic timeline, just a straight line, and you have your moment of speech. So what do we get here? I am driving to Boston. That's the purple line. So here's the am driving. In other words, you're driving as you speak. Now, the subjunctive here, if I drive, that's the red line. Okay, if I drive 2 more hours, that's this part right here. All right, then you say, I will have driven. All right, that means when you're done, it's everything said and done, you will have driven in total the blue line here. Okay, and here's your tenses in traditional sense. So you see here that your time phrase, your helpful little phrasal hint, is before, during, and after the moment of speech. You see, you have some before stuff here. Okay, you have your during right here, and then you have your after right here. So your time phrase is before, during, and after the moment of speech. And that's about it. I hope it didn't take too long. I wanted to go over that, make sure everything's clear regarding my ideas on verb tense, and I'd like to move on to my esoterica videos. I have 2 medical appointments next week, and I'll find out if I'm going to live a couple more months or a couple more years, and then I'll get back into video making. So thanks for being incredibly patient, and good night.